Hello and welcome to this top 10 most likely unseen issues for the November 2019 strategic case study exam on courier and delivery company Runn. So before we start, I'm just going to go through a bit of an introduction to this particular video and where I've got the information on and what you need to do with said information. So how have I come up with these top 10? Well, first of all, you look at the focus in the pre-scene. If there's a lot of material in the pre-scene on a certain topic, then it's likely that there is some kind of importance of that topic. It's likely to be brought up in the exam, so there's more to talk about. And that feeds into the second point here, the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. But that particular section extends beyond purely what's in the pre-scene, but also what CIMA like to examine. For example, ethics. It may be that there's no real mention of ethics in the case study, but ethics is considered very important by CIMA, and therefore they are likely to examine it. Next is the strategic importance. How important is it to the organization? If a certain topic is very important to the company, for example, say their suppliers. If they rely very heavily on a certain supplier, then it's likely that there might be an issue on the supplier. If something were to happen to that supplier, what impact could that have on the business? And also, just a more general experience in doing these videos in creating mock exams and reviewing exams in the past, the typical kind of issues that come up, and what kind of things have the examiner brought up in the past. And my final point here is about how easy it is to write issues on that subject. The people who write the exams are obviously people too, and they will go for ones that they know, that they can write good questions on. So what do you need to do for these issues? Well, first of all, it's important to prepare key models. So this will be things like your SWOT exam, like SWOT analysis, like your PESTLE analysis. Because building up this information now will help you to adapt the new information given you in the unseen, or help you to have that context to apply the unseen material. Next thing you need to do is practice exam questions on these issues. This will help you to understand the kind of questions that will be asked around these topics and how to answer them. And also, this next section here, it will help you to plan these answers in your mind so that when you go into the exam and you start writing, you'll already have a background in which to apply this new information. You'll already have certain points to bring up in your head as you're writing for them. And I've also put some more generic things here, such as the advantages and disadvantages of these certain topics, where they would be used and how models can be used to support them. So let's move on to the top 10 issues now. And the first issue that we are going to look at is that of risk management. Now, risk management is one of the most, if not the most important P3 topic. In fact, P3 is called risk management. And often this will revolve around looking at identifying key risks, how you are going to manage them and map them effectively, looking at how you would put in controls to control the risks effectively. And the pre-scene had an entire section, a couple of pages worth, dedicated solely to looking at the risks that were going on at the organization. And those of you who watched the videos, we also brought out plenty of other risks as well. Risks regarding staff, the potential that staff will strike, the operational risks, in addition to the ones already in the pre-scene. There was some governance risk over succession planning, over the fact that there was no nomination committee, despite the fact that they had got the other committees present at the organization. There's also risks over the vehicles that they are using as well, how expensive they are. The depreciation charges are getting very high against them, but there is also a pressure on organizations to be more efficient, be more economical. A company like this inherently is going to have a lot of problems with damage to the environment because of the sheer amount of transport, the sheer amount of vehicles, aircraft, lorries, etc. that are going to be used by the company. And if they were in a position where the law changed with regards to emissions, as there is pressure on governments to do, then that could cause problems for the company because they would have to replace or potentially replace a lot of their vehicles. And they only have 3 billion in the bank, which seems like a lot of money, but you think about the costs involved in replacing such an enormous fleet of vehicles and aircraft, etc., it would be eaten up very, very quickly. And also, risk management is just simply one of the most examined topics in the strategic case study exam, often as a add-on issue, because it's part of the role. You should always be considering risk management. It's part of the role that you've been given by CIMA. So it's unlikely that you're going to be given a very specific question simply asking you to look at these risks here, talk about these risks here, analyze these risks here, because you were tested on issues like that when you did your P3 exam. This is more about being able to integrate risk identification and risk management into the questions as you are answering them. So it could be looking for the key risks on a specific project. Perhaps the organization is wanting to replace some of its vehicles with autonomous vehicles. Amazon have got drones, etc., and that's an example of a real-life company that has been using autonomous technology for delivery. So what are the risks involved in that? Well, there's risks in terms of the cost involved. There's risks with regards to liability. What if an autonomous vehicle injures someone? There's the risk that certain staff may have to be made redundant. We have very high staff costs, and if we're going to be replacing some of them with driverless vehicles, that's going to cause friction, that's going to cause conflict, it's going to cause problems amongst the staff that are leaving and the ones that aren't leaving. Then there's the risk of there being a strike as a result. And of course, we're such a finely tuned organization using this wheel and spoke system all over the planet that a breakdown in one area, a hold up in one depot, for example, it could cause a knock-on effect across the entire world. Or it could be to do with general risk management within the organization. Are the risks effective enough? Has it been managed effectively enough? Is the risk committee effective enough? The risk committee in the case is staffed by non-executive directors, which is perhaps unusual. Usually the risk committee will feature people from all across the organizations to ensure decent breadth and depth of risk assessment. We've also got some issues here over how risks should be managed at the company. So should the audit committee be installing a culture of risk within, or risk management within the organization? And again, these are things that you're not going to be given very specific questions on, as in you're not just going to be told simply to identify the risks on a project or how should we manage risks in our company. Because again, that is too specific, that's too technical, that is a P3 question, that is not a strategic case study question. So it's more about integrating this information into your answers, whatever those answers may be. And of course, risk is part of the role that you're playing, and therefore, as a result, it is expected throughout your strategic case study exam. There were quite a few risks that were mentioned in the pre-scene, so risks to do with competition, so very intense competition. There's a lot of overlap between the different companies. There's also the risks that clients, large clients, for example, an Amazon type company starting to do its own delivery services. There's a risk to reputation. The culture is changing, the industry is changing, and it's very much about the customer, what the customer wants, what the recipient of the packages of the parcels wants, and they are becoming more and more entitled and expective of immediate next day delivery at the drop of a hat. But that is just how the industry is changing. That gives the company a bit of a headache in terms of, from a logistical perspective, the need for information technology, the need for information management, etc., and for staff to be well trained and to have enough staff available to simply carry out all of these deliveries is critical. The company needs to be continually investing in the organization, investing to counteract and mitigate the effects of this changing industry, and yet they don't have that much money available, and also they are paying out a huge proportion of any profit that they generate in dividends at a time when they perhaps should be reinvesting in the organization. They had 83% of the net income that they generated in the previous year, they paid out in dividends rather than reinvesting it back into the organization. And this was billions and billions of G dollars. Also, it's like governance risk here, just to mention that they didn't have a nomination committee, despite the fact that they had all the other committees. And this is one of the important committees within corporate governance and ties directly to appointing directors to the board of directors, which is very important because the directors run the organization, and also it can have a big impact on the share price when major players within the organization, the directors, etc., leave. And not having a decent plan in place to replace them can have a negative impact on the share price, which of course as a listed company is a big deal for us. So there are a few ones that you can use, a few theories that you can use here. You can mention the audit committee, mention the remit of the audit committee, and if they are not installing enough of a culture of risk management throughout the organization, if they are not overseeing the risk committee well enough, the risk committee itself as well, perhaps it needs more people from more parts of the organization in order to run effectively, then you need to be mentioning that that is part of their role. They are not doing it properly if that is the case. Risk mapping is another method that you could suggest they perhaps use instead of a risk report. And risk mapping is very much the same, but the difference between it and a risk report is that it scores the impact that it will have on the business and the likelihood of it occurring out of 5. And then you can multiply those two scores together, and that allows you to prioritize and manage the risks or manage your resources towards mitigating those risks more effectively, because rather than just taking each one by one or struggling to decide which one you're going to deal with, you actually get on and deal with the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. So, for example, if there is a risk that is a 5 out of 5 for impact, and it's a 5 out of 5 for likelihood of happening, so basically it's this will happen in the next month or two, and it will have an enormous impact. It may even destroy the business. That is something that you need to be dropping everything and solving right away. Likewise, if there is one that's a 1 for impact and a 1 for likelihood, so basically it's really unlikely that it's actually going to happen. No, it's a 1 in 100 chance that it'll actually happen. And to be honest, if it did happen, we probably wouldn't even notice it because it would have no impact. That's not something you need to be concerning yourself with. The TARA management model, so looking at how you can transfer risk, accept, reduce, or avoid them, is a useful one. It's a useful checklist sometimes to run through if you are unsure of how to deal with a risk. And also the big one is the COSO risk methodology. And again, all these models, you should be talking about them from a holistic strategic implementation perspective, not a technical perspective. And what I mean by this is, yes, by all means, talk about the COSO risk methodology and how it can help the business, how it could identify areas that need to be dealt with, etc. But do not spend half an hour going through the entire thing, talking about strategic, talking about operations, talking about entity level and divisional level and business unit risk assessment, control activities, because you are not going to be asked a question like that. You're not going to be asked a question to analyze the COSO risk cube. So only use it from a very high level strategic implementation perspective. And just like risk management, funding is often used as part of another question. It's an add-on issue. And again, like risk management, it's mentioned in your CIMA guide. So these two are in the top 10 issues because they are always needing to be considered regardless of what question you're answering. Questions that you may think have nothing to do with risk or nothing to do with funding still need referencing because they are part of the role that you are playing in. Like risk management is a key P3 model, this is a key F3 model. And so likely issues regarding raising financing could come from a significant amount of money being raised, so long-term funding requirements such as to acquire a company. We know the company does expand through acquisition or to invest into new projects to organically grow, or could be even just to take care of short-term working capital. We have a lot of trade payables, we have a lot of regular expenses, and negative cash flow needs to be considered. We don't have that much cash in the bank at the moment. So that could be another issue here, is to just take on some short-term financing, short-term funding to help the organization, aid the organization in the short term. I've got some key points from the pre-scene for you here. So at the 30th of September 2019, so that's when the financial statements were up to, the organization had just over 3 billion, so 3,090 million in the bank. But this does not mean that this is all available to invest, which is a mistake students often make. A lot of it will be needed for working capital. Our current liabilities, our trade payables, are already more than the cash we have available. And the cash that we need for monthly wages, well, which will be over 2 billion. We've got over 27 billion in staff costs at this organization. And that represents 63% of our overall operating expenses. And it's more than half of the revenue that we generate. More than half the revenue we generate comes on paying staff costs. And so if it's a very rough estimate, you divide that over 12 months, that's more than 2 billion a month in staff costs. And you can't just say, well, we'll push back and we'll gain more credit on our staff. We'll say we'll pay them next month instead because we need to worry about our cash. We can't do that with things like wages. So having cash available in case of negative cash flows in certain months is crucial for an organization like this. And also, it's part of a prudent financial strategy to simply just have some money available, to always have a set amount of buffer income in case of, or buffer cash in the bank in case of any situation like this where we cannot pay our bills. And some other points to bring up. Again, it's more about using material from the pre-scene. That's what the examiner actually wants to see you doing. So just dropping in some of these facts and figures to help aid your analysis to add weight to your answer is very useful. So the debt funding is currently very high. So depending on whether you use the debt over equity or debt over debt plus equity, it's 56 or 128%. And that could make raising additional funding quite difficult. We may be seen as quite high risk for a bank, but we do have quite a substantial amount of tangible assets to raise money against, to use as security. And the general order of raising funds is to always use cash if possible for very, very small projects that aren't going to make a big impact on your cash reserves because it's quicker and easier. It's money that's just available for that. Then you should use debt financing. And then finally, unless it's an absolutely enormous amount of money that you need to raise, you use equity as the last method you use because it's so time consuming and so expensive to raise money this way. It can take up to a year to raise money through equity financing. And when discussing whether or not to use debt or equity financing, you can use the classic advantages and disadvantages. So for example, with debt can often be very quick. It's quite low cost. You often just go to the bank or whoever your lender is, get the money, sign the contracts, and it's done. Whereas with equity, it can be very expensive, very time consuming. But the advantage of equity financing compared with debt is whilst it takes a lot longer, whilst it can be a lot more expensive, it is money that once you have raised, you do not necessarily ever need to pay it back because dividends are completely optional. And this company could afford to drop its dividend payout by a reasonable proportion because it's already paying out a huge amount every year and reinvest some more of that into the business. So that's the advantage of using equity funding, particularly if it's a huge amount of money. If you've got to borrow billions and billions from a bank, then your interest payments, your finance costs are going to be very high. Whereas if you use equity, you do not actually have to pay it back if you do not want, or if there is a real reason that you explain to your shareholders why you're not paying out dividends. And regardless of whether you use a bank or you use equity financiers, put them in the Mendelow's matrix because they become an important stakeholder to your organization. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it and more importantly, you have found it useful. I'd like to finish by just telling you a few things about the products that we produce here at Astranti and the ones that are part of our course. So these materials can all be purchased as part of the course or purchased individually. So we have our study text. We have 3 study texts for all the objective test exams. So 3 study texts for E1, P1, F2, F3, etc. But we also have the study text specifically for the case study exams, split into 2 parts. The first is about how to approach the exam, how to analyze the information, how to plan your answers, how to write your answers, and also the second part, which looks at the key theories from the objective test levels that are relevant to the particular case study. So if you are looking at P2, F2, E2 for the management exam, F3, P3, E3 for the strategic case study exam, and so on. We have our course videos, which look at how to plan your answers, how to manage your time effectively. These are the key reasons why people fail the exam. We have our pre-scene analysis, which looks at the pre-scene in a lot of depth, applies key information to that, and also concludes with the strategic analysis, where we look at the various different models in the CIMA syllabus and apply them to the case, and also the top 10 most likely issues to arise in your exam. Generally, we have a 70 to 80% accuracy rate on our top 10 issues. Our industry pack, which details in great depth the history and the current contemporary issues within the particular industry that the pre-scene is based on. We also have 20 to 25 industry examples that you can use within your answers. We have mock exams that can be purchased with or without marking and feedback, where you can get some real exam practice in, look for the kinds of things that the examiner is going to bring up in the exam, and also get marking and feedback from expert markers who have marked for CIMA and for us for many years, who know exactly the kinds of things that the examiner is looking for, exactly the kinds of mistakes that students often make, and can provide lots of detailed feedback to ensure that you improve on your performance. We also have our master classes, which are 2 day-long classes which look at all the key issues facing students in the exam. We will also go through live planning, showing you how to plan your answers effectively, how to write your answers effectively. Again, key things that cause people to fail the strategic case study exam, or any of the case study exams for that matter. And also, if you do sign up for our course, provided that you have filled out your forms, provided that you have submitted your mocks, provided you have done everything to show that you have really given it your all to try and pass this exam, we also offer a pass guarantee, giving a free resit to anyone who fails the exam.